Is inequality normal? Viridiana Ríos, a Mexican political analyst who has a PhD in public policies from the University of Harvard, says no. And she doesn't only say no, she also explains why in her new best-selling book, This Ain't Normal, No es Normal. She talks about how inequality is not only something that is not normal in the sense that it is something that is normalized, although it shouldn't be. She also says that we can do something about it. We can change it. There are things to do, and exactly what these things are in all sorts of different dimensions. In this episode of Future Frame TV, we talk with Viridiana about inequality in Mexico and that this ain't normal. If you want to know more about, for example, what Shakira has to do with public hospitals, or which strategy tortilla makers in the south of Mexico share with pharmaceutical companies, you will want to know more about this book, because these things and loads of others are explained in there. And we'll talk about it in our upcoming conversation. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Futures Frame TV, to a new episode, to a new season with our Inequalities channel. I'm Krozer, your host, and the program is presented by Traces.Dreams. Today, we want to talk about inequality in Mexico. And for that, we invited a special guest, Viridiana Ríos, who is a political analyst, and she's an expert in public policy. She's also a columnist at the New York Times and at El País. Viridiana, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Alice.
It's great to have you, especially considering that you're now a best-selling author. Congratulations.
Thank you.
First of all, how does that feel? Is it good?
It feels great. I feel that the book is filling a market, a special market that was not filled, I guess, before, which is the market for understanding inequality from the point of view not of political science, but not of economics, but of public policy. I feel that that's why.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, people are really keen to learn more about inequality, and especially when it's not so abstract and academic as what we usually produce. So there's definitely a niche for this kind of content. And I mean, you found it directly. The book is called No es Normal. I guess This Ain't Normal,
Yes.
or something like that.
Great.
And the subtitle says that it's about an occult game that features or furthers the inequality in Mexico and how we can change that. What do you mean by the game? What are you describing in the book, and what is the book about?
Well, we are using a very regular concept, in this case of public policy, about the rules of the game, right? The rules of the game are the institutions, the formal and informal rules that exist in a specific country or in a polity, and that drive the behavior of different actors within the market or in public institutions. So I think that the subtitle is really commenting about the fact that the rules of the game, meaning institutions formal and informal, have been rigged in favor of the wealthy, of big companies, and to the detriment of the middle class and the rest of the people in Mexico.
And would you say this is like a very Mexican phenomenon that you're describing, or is this something more general, or what is the audience, let's say? I mean, we're talking about this book in English now. It will hopefully soon be out in English at some place.
Yes.
For now, we have to read it in Spanish. But do you think there is a more general message in there than just for the Mexican population?
Absolutely. I actually think this is a global phenomenon. That's why you have like a whole, season of discussing and commenting of these topics. But, and I guess that's my hypothesis, Mexico is a particularly bad case in terms of the design of these rules. What types of rules? Where I would say competition rules and antitrust rules, fiscal and taxation rules, and also labor laws. Right? So actually the book explores each of these three sets and others. Like I also talk a little bit about like gender discrimination and the skin tone, all of the agenda, that exists in Mexico about discrimination by skin tone. But I would say that those three areas, fiscal, labor, and antitrust, are the main drivers of the book and are really like where the whole hypothesis of the rig game comes from.
Yeah, this is actually one of the particularities maybe of your book. When we think about expert books on inequality, they tend to be about something very specific, one aspect of which, is great. But your book has this advantage, I'd say, for people that are not necessarily experts yet on inequality, that it covers a really broad range of topics and it connects them all to this one thing, which is inequality. And it has so many different faces or expressions, right, or dimensions, if you will. Could you get a little bit more into these different areas and why you think that these three specific areas that you mentioned, and I would add the gender dimension, which I think is explained very touchingly and very impacting in your chapters there. Could you explain a little bit more why you think these are the key parts to understand when we talk about institutions that perpetuate inequality?
Yes. So this book is a survey about everything we know in terms of inequality and why inequality is so large in Mexico. Nobody has done a survey before, and this survey comes with a specific hypothesis, which is like a main line that connects all of the research on inequality that I read and that I conducted, because this book also contains pieces of specific research conducted for this text. And this hypothesis, this like line that connects all of the research, in my opinion, is the fact of these, rate gains in terms of the laws, and in terms of, I don't want to say only the laws, because sometimes it's just procedures. It's like sometimes it's even informal things, right? I would say that these three areas are the most important, also because at the upfront of how we think of inequality and reducing inequality, we're also thinking about three different things, I would say. The first one is, how do we reduce inequality before it happens, before the market? How do we reduce it within the market, like in terms of labor and business practices? And then how do we correct inequality once it happens? And this third part is mostly fiscal policy. So I would say that the book covers all of these three areas. And so, for example, if you go to the first part, right, which is how do we avoid inequality from existing in the first place, then you start discussing things like inheritance taxation, which is something I discuss, or gender inequality, right? Like we should not have females making less money, 12% less in the case of Mexico than men. If you go into the middle ground, which is how do we reduce inequality within the market, then you start really thinking about two things: antitrust and competition, a big topic recently in the literature in the developed world, and then labor laws, right? How do we make sure that people increases their wages and takes a good part of the profit created by companies? And that's like a second part of the book. And then the final part is fiscal. And in that, for example, the book discusses how do we collect property taxes? How do we make sure that we reduce evasion and illusion in Mexico? It has a really interesting chapter, in my opinion, about fiscal paradises and how can we avoid the use of fiscal paradises in Mexico, and so on, right? Like the long list of fiscal fixes that we need to do in order to reduce inequality.
And maybe here it's ad hoc, it's at point to say something more about Mexico, about the specific context, right? Because Mexico uses fiscal paradise, of course, but you even argue that it could be considered a fiscal paradise in many aspects. And the particularities of the Mexican context are exactly that labor laws are protecting labor very poorly, and especially wages are very low. Fiscal policy is very non-redistributive, or at least not very progressively. And also there are these other dimensions of horizontal or group inequalities, like gender inequality and discrimination by phenotype or specific characteristics like skin tone. So the combination of these worst case scenarios, I guess, for all these three or more dimensions that you discuss, what does that mean for the specific context of Mexico?
Well, it means that we don't have a middle class, and we are seeing the middle class, just like becoming smaller and smaller, while at the same time we observe, the billionaires, the 15 billionaires of Mexico City becoming more and more wealthy. But let me go back a little bit about the rules, because I'd like to discuss some of the rules that I have in mind. Of course, we don't have time to discuss all of them, but I think that maybe we can go over a couple. One of the rules that I discuss in the book is the banking system, and how the banking system without competition has become one of the most profitable banking systems in the world. That's amazing. That's shocking in itself. And it ain't to be like that, right? It shouldn't be like that. And therefore, we need to change the rules, the regulation that we have for the financial industry in order for it to become more competitive. Second, I also talk about fiscal changes, right? And in that, I would say that one of the most important ones that I discuss is how Mexico is really not collecting property taxes. When you look at how much property taxes Mexico is collecting, it collects about a third of what is collected in Latin America, which is already a region that really doesn't collect a lot of property taxes in itself. So that, a second part of the discussion of the book is about how do we make sure that property taxes are collected and this goes into a discussion about governance, because at the end, in Mexico, property taxes are part of the local legislation and not federal, right? So that completely changes how do you structure the capacity of the government in order to actually access to these resources. Third, in terms of labor regulation, one of the discussions of the book is about how we are not really preparing our laws in order to react to the new forms of labor that are emerging. The gig economy, but also the reality of younger people, which is that they don't really work on the same company for a long time. And therefore, the way we used to have unions in Mexico, which is a union within a company, is not really protecting a lot of people anymore. So we need to update our labor laws that were created literally 100 years ago after the revolution. So that needs to be, that needs to be changed. And then finally, I would say that in terms of antitrust, that's a huge topic. I actually think that's one of the main topics of the book, because nobody had addressed that topic, I would say, before on a public audience book in Mexico. And basically what the book shows is that our antitrust policies are a joke. And we are a country of, a monopoly country, where the same companies that were successful 45 years ago are still successful today. Something that you don't observe even in very dysfunctional capitalisms like the US. And something that is revealing of the fact that the market in Mexico is kind of like a fallacy that really only exists for poor people and the middle classes, but not for the people with wealth and for big companies.
And how do they manage? How do they come around? I mean, you have a wonderful chapter there on lawyers and on their role in perpetuating the situation. But, how do they get to this position?
Well, they get to this position because there is no separation between the political decision makers and the economic decision makers. So I guess that this is something profound. It comes from, this is not something that is from now. It comes probably from even before the Mexican Revolution, and is revealing about how the economic elites have managed to collude with decision makers and with policy makers in Mexico in order to create regulations that favor them and that make a small business very vulnerable to different regulation and to different crises.
The title of your book, of course, alludes to this strangeness of the situation, right? But at the same time, you say that it's something that can be observed all over the world, and in some sense, it's the paradigm of the day, right? To analyze inequality. But you say this is not normal. Can you say a little bit more about what you would like to convey with this idea that this is not normal?
Yeah, I think that this is not normal, doesn't translate very well to English, because in Spanish it's a very short and kind of like very powerful, like short phrase that appeals to basically two things. The first thing is we should not normalize the fact that the rules of the game are rigged in favor of the wealthy. So it's a claim for, waking up and an awakening that this is not a normal situation. This is something abnormal, right? But the second one, and this is kind of like a game in how the phrase works in Spanish, it talks about how it shouldn't be like that, right? So it's not normal has kind of like also this connotation that even if it's normal, even if it happens, right, it should not be like that. So then it's kind of like a game of these words. And one thing that I have noticed is that the readers of the book increasingly use by themselves in Twitter, in like social media, everywhere, the phrase no es normal, which is not normal, right? To refer to different things, not even related directly to the book. So I feel that, that's why it's kind of like it's very sticky.
Yeah, it sparked a
phrase.
whole movement, right?
Yes, it's a little bit like that.
Yes, no, it's wonderful. I mean, it's a great catchphrase, and it perfectly describes this, and it brings us to the question: if this has to be changed, then what are some of the solutions? I mean, you offer some in the book, but what do you think should be done about changing this situation?
I think, at the core, I always get this question, right? And the question is, okay, now you are saying that the rules of the game are not working for us, for the majority of citizens in Mexico, and you actually point towards which ones are those rules in a specific, because that's what the book does, right? And what can we do now with all of this information, right? And people become
It's a lot of information.
It's a lot of information, but I feel that people becomes a little bit frustrated sometimes. But the answer is just, we need to play politics. We need to play democracy. We need to organize and demand that the political class in Mexico and our politicians respond to the voices of the middle classes and the rest, and not, as it has been, only to the voice of the wealthy. So the wealthy in Mexico they are very well organized. The banking system is very well organized, like the reason why we have these rules is not random. Is the organization of loving and very structured, ways of conveying the preferences of the wealthy to the public policy, cycle, and eventually turning them into law. So we should play that. And I feel that it sounds kind of like, a long way, because it's like, and then how do you organize, how do you play politics? But I feel that we need to, as middle classes, to start discussing how do we conquer the spaces of decision making within Congress and inside political parties.
One particularity that I have observed in Mexico, and this might be the outsider's view, is that there is some kind of fatalism almost sometimes, that the situation is very bad, but there is nothing that we can really do about it. And maybe this frustration that you hear from your readers that say, okay, now what do we do, comes from this sense of powerlessness. Do you have some incentive or some insights or some intuition of how this could be overcome? Kind of like the concrete steps. How do we start organizing?
When I was a kid, there was a very famous TV show on the public channel in Mexico, Channel 11, and the name of this show was "This is where we have to live." Aquí nos tocó vivir, right, in Spanish. And I feel that that's a little bit of the mentality that you are pointing to, because we grew up, looking, and this program was about showing people living in poverty, in vulnerability, in very hard circumstances. And kind of like the message of this program was like, well, but even if we live in these conditions, this is our fate, and we still find, some ways of enjoyment in our families or stuff, right? And I feel that we need to destroy that culture. We need to destroy this culture of mediocrity, of just saying, well, this is where I was born. No, this is where we as a society, decided that people is gonna be. Because at the end, what people call in Mexico, there is this say of, oh, well, this is the system, meaning like this is how it works, right? But what I constantly say to my readers is, look, what you call the system in reality is a very specific set of rules that are encoded in our laws and in our processes. So the system is not something ethereal, like the matrix. The system can be changed. And we just need to pinpoint clearly, to where exactly and how we change it.
And start at some concrete place.
Start in a concrete place. That sometimes, it's kind of like it sounds like, oh wow, this is like a huge endeavor. How do we change the country, right? But in the book, I think I tried to make an effort to say simple things, even simple things that could change, and that would make a huge difference.
What have been some of the responses to the book by your readers? Have they surprised you in some way, or was it just predictably saying, yeah, we knew this already? And
I never imagined that a book of public policy that discusses inequality, which are like, technical topics over technical topics, would be read as much. Because in Mexico, the literature that exists, the literature for like a general public that exists, is mostly about two topics, I would say: politicians and gossips about politicians, and drug traffickers and gossips about drug traffickers, right? But we didn't have this type of book that is actually very technical in disguise, right? And yes, because it's very technical, but I try to make it very readable.
It's true, yeah.
and I never imagined that. Sometimes I present the book and I notice, for example, I went to present it to the Senate, and I thought that the senators were going to buy the book at the end, and they did. But not only the senators did, also the staff from the Senate, like the people that was serving the senators, came to buy the book, and they were telling me, you know what, this that you're saying, nobody has said to us before. So I feel that there is, hunger in Mexico for changing the country, and for like not talk anymore about politicians and talk about the real, things that are inhibiting the country from achieving a more developed stage.
And do you think that's a sign of the times are changing, or is that happenstance? I mean, the book is very well written and is full of information and very updated numbers and everything. Of course, it's going to be interesting. But do you think there is a larger movement, let's say, or moment behind, so that it falls right into something that it can be fed on?
I do think Mexico is going through a moment of transformation, not because of our government, but because of our people and the awareness of our people. I would say that the corruption that the people observed openly, that was observed completely openly in the last administration, and that hasn't been fixed by this administration, is something that is constantly bothering people and making them aware of, the problems that we have in Mexico. And a second one is the pandemic. Mexico was hit very hard by the pandemic, but it was not hit the same way if you are poor than if you are wealthy. And the poor in Mexico die 5 times more than the wealthy, which is something ridiculous. And I feel that also created this sense of like, this is not normal. We should change it.
And do you think it has the potential for a resistance, or does the resistance now come from the other side, trying to stop this change?
You mean if we talk about the political spectrum, and the political spectrum in Mexico right now it has two sides. One is, are you in favor of everything the president does, or are you against everything the president does, right? So those are the two aisles. This book breaks those aisles because it shows things that this government is doing well, and it shows things that this government hasn't even touched, right? Because most of the rules of the game are very similar to the rules of the game before the current administration. So I don't know if we're gonna see an emergence of like a third, like, way. But I do, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we are maturing more and more as a democracy and discussing different topics.
Well, it's good to hear that you're hopeful. But after the reading, it's not always clear whether we can or should be so optimistic or not. I mean, in general, your tone is very optimistic in the book, right? you always offer a solution to the problems that you describe. So that's very helpful. But after reading, 26 or something chapters,
25
or chapters on different areas that are just completely wrong, one also can get a little bit depressed about the situation. Has that ever happened to you in the process?
No, because you know what? I'm a very optimistic person to begin with. Otherwise, I couldn't do what I do. But second is, when I wrote this book, I wanted to tell people everything that I was not told when I studied college and when I studied high school. And the goal of this book was to convey that information that you eventually get, but in graduate school, or you eventually get, but by yourself, just because of curiosity. If you have the time and the privilege to be capable of keep reading about different topics. So I just wanted, this book to convey basic ideas that we should know about Mexico and its problems to the general public, the same way that you get, class about, general history. I think you should get a class about gender inequality and why this country is,
we're working on this.
That's correct. So that's the book. Yeah.
Viri, before we come to a close, maybe it's a little bit more personal question, but I'd like to ask you how you came to think about these things in the first place, or what made you think that it was necessary and a good idea to write a book, or to even start researching these subjects, or to get interested in these subjects in a context that is, yes, obviously very unequal, but that doesn't mean that everybody has these urges to study more profoundly.
Well, I would say two things. The first one is my own life, right? Because I grew up in Mexico City, but in a neighborhood in a working class neighborhood that was, I would say, quite vulnerable. And moving all the way from there to eventually, being here talking to you and, studying, for example, my PhD at Harvard, as I did in political science. I think that showed me the different faces of Mexico in ways that were very shocking. So, I remember the first time that I met people that, I don't know, didn't know simple things about Mexico, like they had never used the public transportation. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like this is just so, outlandish. I cannot believe they have never really done that, when it's something that you do every day of your life when you are born in a different neighborhood, right? So I feel that was one thing. The second one was my own life as an academic. Before turning into a full-time journalist and political analyst, I was an academic. And in every single topic that I study, I think inequality was probably one of the most important causal effects of different things, from organized crime to, low salaries. Like when you study Mexico, inequality is kind of like the big elephant in the room, and you just cannot stop like looking at it and observing its consequences.
I think it's very telling that usually, or very often, and unfortunately maybe, when we talk about ignorance or lack of knowledge, we often speak about people that are not formally educated. But in the example that you bring, it's people that have all access to perfectly good education and resources of all sorts, and they're completely unknowledgeable about huge aspects of the country, right? As you say, like using public transport or any kind of public service, for that matter, health or social security, etc. So maybe this is also there's an agenda, let's say, or an educational part to writing this book or to researching these subjects for parts of the population that we usually don't think about as undereducated. Would that be correct?
Completely. Yeah, that's a great point. We need to educate our wealthy, probably more than we need to educate the rest of society, because they are very ignorant.
Well, we're continuously working on that. Is there anything you would like to add that I haven't mentioned about your wonderful book besides go and get it?
Just go and get it. For the international audience, it's only available as Kindle, but you can get it on Amazon if you want. So hopefully you read it.
Will there be a translation?
Hopefully, yes. I'm going to be working on that.
Excellent. Well, that's really very good news in these somewhat somber but hopeful scenarios. Edie, thank you so much for joining us in this episode about normality, I guess, or unnormality in inequality.
All the things that are not normal in Mexico and how to change them. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yes, thank you so much.
It was wonderful to have you. And thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. We hope that you like this conversation. And if you do, then please share it and join us again next time for another conversation about inequalities. Have a good afternoon and see you soon.